Hello and welcome to WION's Climate Tracker, your daily dose of news on the climate crisis. I'm Rohit Wellington Rajan. Let's take a look at what we have for you on the show today. The storm that devastated Rolling Fork in Mississippi is possibly an event that cannot be connected directly to climate change. But the worst is not over. Projections say the lethal storms will now edge eastward to strike more frequently in the Mid-South region of the United States. Studies suggest America will now get more killer tornado and hail-spawning supercells as the world warms. The study in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society predicts a nationwide 6.6% increase in supercells and at least 25.8% jump in the area and time of these supercells by the end of the century. But in certain areas of the southern region, the increase predicted is much higher. This includes Rolling Fork in Mississippi. Projections are that Mississippi will witness an increase of at least one supercell a year by the year 2100.
Supercells are the dominant producers of significant tornadoes and hail. So when we talk about killer tornadoes, damaging hail, they're produced by supercells. So we're actually taking a step up scale, right, and looking at the parent storm. Not that they're very big. They're relatively small, 20 miles wide at most, but they're very powerful. I always liken them to peanuts. They're very small, but they have a lot of protein, a lot of fat, a lot of calories, a lot of energy.
Describing supercells as nature's ultimate storms and the so-called finger of God, the professor of meteorology and disaster geography at the Northern Illinois University said that the tall, anvil-shaped and sky-filling supercells have a rotating, powerful updraft of wind. They say that this drift can last for several hours. While the study used computer simulations to predict what will happen by the end of the century with different levels of global carbon pollution levels, a professor at the Northern Illinois University said that a stormier future is already here.
And I am loading the hell out of it, right? I'm loading it with more people, more vulnerability, more exposure, more cars, more roofs, more whatever. And on the other die is risk. And I'm increasing the odds of supercells. So what does that mean? I'm increasing the odds of the perils too, tornadoes and hail.
While officials in Rolling Fork are surveying and cleaning up the damage after a powerful tornado on Friday night, the blow resulted in the death of at least 26 residents in the town and one in Alabama. The impact is said to have been so severe that it lasted for about an hour and 10 minutes, destroying buildings and leaving hundreds without shelter. A climate panel in the UK has accused the British government of failing to prepare England to cope with extreme weather. This comes on the back of the hottest British summer on record last year. The committee, which submits a report to the British Parliament every 5 years, said that the country has reached a make-or-break moment, pushing the nation towards becoming more prone to climate risks. According to a new assessment by the Climate Change Committee, not enough has been done to ensure the country is prepared for the future. The committee CEO said that the record-breaking hot summer which England experienced in 2022 should be striking alarm bells.
There are key areas, so we're looking at, for example, the roads and infrastructure that the country has, buildings that we work and live in, key policies not in place to make sure that we're prepared for the hot temperatures, the fact that we have drought, the fact that we have wildfires, the fact that we have water shortages every year, the fact that we're experiencing this intense heat. This is something now that's going to keep coming for this country. It's not something that goes away.
The extreme weather that resulted in the death of at least 2,800 people across the country raised alarm on the state of preparations. The Climate Committee urged the government to take strong measures to protect the people, their homes and livelihoods. The panel pointed out areas which needed action, including heat-proofing homes, stemming leaks from water supply pipes, preparation for flash floods and shortages of food, and imports from nations struck by climate impacts.
We're resilient to the change in the climate when it comes. So a good example of that is buildings. Last year we had, during that 40-degree period of heat that everyone experienced, we had some really challenging circumstances and sadly unprecedented heat-related deaths.
Criticism was also targeted at ineffectiveness of data collection by the government. Professor of Climate Change Economics at Oxford University said that the nation is not really pushing for a technological breakthrough, stressing that there's more words than action.
On the adaptation side, this is much more a question of tested processes, tested technologies, tested behavioral change. We know how to do flood protection. This is a matter of setting budgets aside and sort of making those infrastructure investments happen. We have quite good understanding of how a health resilience plan might look and how we can protect vulnerable people against overheating. We know how one does that. It's a matter of putting those processes and those structures in place.
A recent IPCC report showed that climate damages are hitting harder and faster than expected, and that the global temperature will not stop rising until carbon emissions reach net zero, a target set for 2050 by many countries. Africa continues to suffer immensely. The West or aid organizations haven't stopped pledging funds. However, where does all the money go? We believe it is time for Africans to get the answers to this pertinent question. Watch this special report and know why we insist Africa must wake and stand up now.
It's been 3 months since the year 2023 began, but there's nothing new about the worsening climate change and its impact on humans. In fact, it's getting worse. After battering Madagascar in late February, Cyclone Freddy wreaked havoc in Malawi and Mozambique when it made a second landfall within weeks. Locals, officials and aid workers continue to uncover the full extent of destruction in what may be the longest-lasting tropical cyclone on record. In Malawi, the death toll crossed over 500, with close to 400,000 people still displaced. Before Freddy, Malawi experienced its deadliest cholera outbreak. It is feared that floodwaters could worsen the situation in terms of accessing clean water and sanitation. In Mozambique, at least 66 died and nearly 59,000 were displaced. Those who survived the fury now face another danger: lack of food. The United Nations has continuously deplored the effects of climate change. It predicts that the worst is yet to come.
Humanity is on thin ice, and that ice is melting fast. As today's report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, details, humans are responsible for virtually all global heating over the last 200 years. The rate of temperature rise in the last half century is the highest in 2000 years. Concentrations of carbon dioxide are at their highest in at least 2 million years. The climate time bomb is ticking.
The Horn of Africa is bearing the brunt of record drought for years. The situation is not getting any better, as 43,000 people were killed in Somalia last year, half of them children under 5.
People became weak because of hunger, so we had to flee for our lives. I came to this camp in Baidoa during the month of Ramadan. My wife died of hunger here, and I became helpless. All my livestock and crops were also wiped out.
Across Africa, from east to west, people are experiencing a food crisis that is bigger and more complex than the continent has ever seen. According to data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, 1 in 5 Africans, a record 278 million, were already facing hunger or famine in 2021. It says the situation has worsened. East Africa has missed 4 consecutive rainy seasons, the worst drought in 40 years. Nearly 22 million people across Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia face high levels of acute food insecurity, a number projected to rise up to 26 million by mid-2023 if the rains fail again. In Chad, over 19,000 head of livestock was swept away as floods ravaged the country. In neighboring Nigeria, flooding hit 29 of the 36 states by the end of last year. The rains continue to pour this year. More countries in the west and east are experiencing a change in the weather patterns. This deluge has cut off supplies of food to remote regions. Then there is conflict, which has long been a driver of hunger. War forces civilians from their homes, livelihoods, farms and food sources. It also makes it dangerous to deliver assistance. The number of displaced people in Africa has tripled over the past decade to a record 36 million in 2022, according to UN data that represents almost half of the displaced people in the world. Most were displaced internally within their own countries by conflict. According to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, a crisis monitoring group, conflicts are worsening across the continent.
We want to bear witness in the face of a situation which is intolerable, which is not acceptable. What is happening here in Eastern Congo is unacceptable. What is happening in Eastern Congo must be brought to light. This is the reason for our presence here. This is the reason for this humanitarian airdrop. This is the reason for our diplomatic and political investment that accompanies this humanitarian bridge.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February last year, which Moscow called a special military operation, added to Africa's problems. All the global bodies, including the UN, WHO and EU, moved their focus to the war and neglected Africa's woes. Disruptions caused by that war also resulted in fertilizer shortage. Where stocks are available, prices have risen beyond the means of many farmers. The result will be smaller harvests this year in West Africa. The World Food Programme estimates cereal production could fall by 20%. 4 of the 5 African countries receiving the most humanitarian funding under the 2022 aid appeal are located in or border the drought-stricken Horn of Africa region. The US announced billions of dollars in additional humanitarian assistance to address acute food insecurity in Africa. The country pledged an additional $2.5 billion in emergency assistance and medium to long-term food security assistance. The United Nations followed suit and made a similar pledge at the 36th African Union Summit in Ethiopia last year.
Around the world today, 339 million people are in need of humanitarian aid, an increase of more than 25% since last year. And so today, here in Addis, I'm announcing the largest ever allocation from our United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, $250 million, to combat famine and to address unfunded emergencies.
Though many critics still question the disbursement of these funds, African governments have done little to prevent food crises from recurring. In a move to boost production, reduce import reliance and improve food security, leaders in 2003 pledged to commit at least 10% of their national budgets to agriculture and rural development within 5 years. By 2021, nearly 2 decades later, just 2 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Mali and Zimbabwe, met that target. Agriculture makes up nearly 20% of Africa's GDP, and more than half of Africans work in the sector. Most of this is low productivity subsistence farming, and the region is a net importer of staples including wheat, palm oil and rice. Productivity and crop yields have increased, but agricultural production per capita is falling. Self-sufficiency for major commodities is decreasing. Without action, the World Bank says Africa's food import bill, which stood at $43 billion in 2019, could rise to $110 billion in 2025. Africa's woes seem to be far from over, and the deplorable famine disaster persists. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Now, Europe is recording soaring temperatures. From France, Spain and Italy, swathes of the continent is boiling. In a revolutionary decision, the European Union has banned new sales of combustion engine cars from 2035. The regulation aims to impose a 100% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by the cutoff date, effectively prohibiting the purchase of new passenger cars and vans powered by fossil fuels such as diesel and petrol. The deal was made official during a meeting of the EU's energy and transport ministers in Brussels, where the regulation was given a final approval. But after a last-minute campaign by Germany, the 2035 ban will exempt vehicles that run exclusively on e-fuels that combine hydrogen and carbon dioxide to produce synthetic fuels. E-fuels are burnt in a traditional engine and therefore release emissions into the atmosphere. But proponents argue that their production process can be climate neutral and offset the pollution. In contrast, detractors argue that e-fuels are expensive, energy inefficient and waste of resources. The current production of e-fuel is very limited and is seen as a niche and luxury market. It is therefore still unclear how big an alternative e-fuels can be to electric vehicles, which are already manufactured on a large scale. Germany's demand to spare e-fuels from the CO2 regulation was seen as highly unusual and had brought the whole legislative process to a halt. The holdout lasted for almost 1 month and triggered intense talks between the European Commission and Germany's Federal Ministry of Transport. The talks bore fruit in the form of a side deal that will open doors to new sales of vehicles that run exclusively on climate-neutral e-fuels to be sold after 2035 deadline. The Commission, however, intends to translate the e-fuels exemption into a delegated act, and if lawmakers reject the act, the executive will propose a full-scale revision of the legislation. The exemption will force manufacturers to develop a device that will distinguish e-fuels from existing oil fuels when drivers fill up their tanks. Italy, Poland, Bulgaria and Romania were among those who had previously expressed reservations about the 2035 ban. But after Germany won a concession from Brussels and lifted its resistance, the 4 countries are now unable to form a so-called blocking minority. The CO2 regulation approved on Tuesday will become law after its publication in the EU's official journal. When was the last time you used plastic? Maybe when you went to buy groceries, or maybe from a shampoo bottle that you used this morning. From cutlery to cups, from plates to glasses, we are surrounded by plastic everywhere. But did you know, for the first time ever, microplastics have been found in human blood. Blood samples from 22 healthy adults were studied. And how did they end up in the bloodstream? What are the chances that there are microplastics in your blood too? And should you be concerned? Plastics are responsible for wide-ranging health effects, including cancers, lung disease, and birth defects. Led by the Boston College of Global Observatory on Planetary Health Partnership with Australia's Foundation and the Centre Scientifique de Monaco, that the review has found that current patterns of plastic production and disposal are not sustainable and are responsible for significant harm to human health as well as for deep societal injustices. The analysis published in the medical journal Annals of Globe Health found that the harm caused by plastics is magnified by low rates of recovery and recycling and by the long persistence of plastic waste in the environment. According to the report, coal miners, oil workers, and gas field workers who extract fossil carbon feedstocks for plastic production, along with plastic production workers, were at particular risk of harm. These workers suffer increased mortality from traumatic injury, cardiovascular disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and lung cancer. That's what the report said. Meanwhile, residents of communities adjacent to plastic production and waste disposal sites experienced an increased risk of premature birth, low birth weight, asthma, childhood leukemia, cardiovascular disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and lung cancer. The report referred to evidence that infants in the womb and young children were at particularly high risk. With recent findings, the report recommended a global plastics treaty to control the manufacture and use of plastics and to reduce the disproportionate health and environmental impacts of plastics on coastal and ocean-dependent communities and those working in high-risk industries. The authors wrote that any treaty should be in accord with the mandate set in March 2022 at the UN Environment Assembly. And with that, it's a wrap on WION's Climate Tracker. Thanks for tuning in. Keep watching WION World is One for all the latest news and updates. Goodbye.